Good day, students. I am delighted to welcome you to this class today. My name is Benjamin Mwindi, and the unit that we are discussing is a BJL4118, which is political reporting and parliamentary reporting. Welcome to the class. And in this class today, we are going to discuss some key concepts and issues that come to play when journalists are reporting news that is related to political events. And specifically, we will look at parliamentary reporting as an example of what is called beat reporting, a very specialized area that not just any journalist is able to just enter into that beat and report competently, because it not just requires experience, but there are certain protocols and certain procedures that one needs to acquaint themselves with. And therefore we will look into some of these procedures and how effectively a journalist then is able to report from Parliament, and also when reporting news that is related to political events and political occurrences, politicians, their political parties, their manifestos, and everything that really makes news, all news fit for print as far as politics and Parliament is concerned. To put to treat the background and context of this is it's important for us to look at a bit of the history that surrounds the idea of parliaments in the world. And literature suggests that parliament as a form of governance and representation is really not a new concept in the society. And it's been around since the Greek civilization, the ancient Greek civilization. That's when the idea of parliament representation started. But it did not start right away with the kind of representation that we have right now. And in the society that is the ancient Greek society, people believed that they could represent themselves. They could represent their needs, they could represent their issues. Every member of the society believed that they could represent, and debate the issues or the laws of their society. And this idea is what literature suggests as direct democracy. So direct democracy and direct representation is where every member of a society would make a contribution directly into issues affecting that society in what was called the democracy. Democracy coming from the prefix that is the word demos, meaning assemblies. So people would gather in agoras and they would debate issues that are affecting their society. And there was no mediated representation. So everybody would make their point, everybody would make their contribution, but that became challenging as a form of governance and as a form of democracy. It became challenging. Why? Because the numbers into the assembly became too large to handle. So you can imagine if it's a society as Kenyan societies, we are talking about almost 50 million citizens. And even if it's not 50 million, because a lot of them are probably under the age of 18, half of that population becomes population that is representing itself directly into the assembly. So that became challenging in terms of logistics of carrying out that business of representation, the logistics of debating so many people. And as a result, it gave birth to what we call representative democracy. And now with representative democracy, the will of the people then started to be expressed through certain elected representatives. So for every population, for every unit of the population, they would have a preferred elected representative. So again, this is also giving birth to the idea of elections, the idea of people putting up their candidature for public office, or for the idea that they need to represent others in the assemblies, which later turned out to be the parliaments. So the people who became elected representatives then were mostly male, and not just mostly, but they were exclusively male into the parliament of, or the so-called assembly of the ancient Greece. So that idea of representative, of representation in the society is what gave rise to the present day democracy. It's what over many centuries of human history gave birth to the idea that now elected leaders start making laws and passing motions and just binding conventions on behalf of the people that they are governing, or the people who are governed under those social units. So that led to the rise of what we call parliament today. But it's important to point out at that point in the Greece civilization, parliament was really a very patriarchal organization or institution of the society, because that institution did not include women. So women were excluded from the Greek assemblies. And even though the Greeks say this is democracy at that point, modern day understanding of democracy really is a very inclusive concept. Democracy becomes a very inclusive concept, such that all members of society, different quotas, different groups of the society are represented within that particular assembly. And if you look at how parliament today is constituted, whether it is the Senate, the upper house and the lower house, you find that there is inclusivity. And this inclusivity doesn't just touch on women. It even touches on different groups in the society, such as the marginalized groups, disabled people, among many other, the youth and so on. So democracy then has a wider articulation, and it's not just the idea of representative, but inclusivity becomes a very important thing. So in this regard, we say that the Greeks failed to achieve democracy that they set out to realize because of lack of inclusivity. Even though then they birthed, or they gave birth, or they gave rise to our understanding of democracy and representative democracy at that. So when you talk about democracy, the notion of majority rule becomes very important to articulate here. And what this means is that unanimity in any given community is impossible to achieve. And for consensus, for people to build consensus around issues, as you know, human beings are rational, and not just rational, but they're also independent. It is not possible to get unanimity at all the time, depending on the issues that you are debating about. Therefore, To get a sense of unanimity, we look at majority. And majority rule means that majority rule is equated to democracy, such that if majority of the people, which constitutes more than half of that sample, are voting for or against a particular law, for instance, or a particular issue that is being debated, then that is seen to be democracy. But it doesn't mean that the minority then who are dissenting are not a part of the democracy. It is just how democracy works, such that the majority of the people have their way, but the minority also have their say. And that's how democracy really works. So people's elected leaders vote on a given issue. It could be health, it could be education, it could be security, anything that is affecting the society. And then the majority view becomes the rule of the law. And although everybody may not necessarily support it. So that is the idea of democracy. When you look at how Kenyan democracy then has been organized, as far as the idea of representation is concerned, you look at the system of governance in Kenya, and since we promulgated a new constitution in August of 2010, this changed the constitution of or the administrative constitution of the government, and it included certain units that we did not previously have, and also it deleted or did away with other units that we did previously have, and in the new dispensation we do not have that. So if you look at the people of the Kenya, of people in a democracy, we talk about democracy being where in a democracy a government is set up by the people to serve the people and for the people. So if then everything starts with the people of Kenya here, and we are trying to understand how the new system of devolved government works, we will see different units that have emerged. And these units include, at this side is the national government. And the national government here is made up of the president and the cabinet that advises the president. And under the cabinet, then there is what you call the civil service, or the national civil service, forming the national government. Then the other structure, or the other end, is what you call now the devolved units of administration. And these are the county governments. And in Kenya, since the constitution passed, there are 47 counties. So each of these counties, they are headed by a governor here. So the will of the people at the county level is represented through the governor. But then issues of representation in that county are debated in the county assembly. The county assembly is the equivalent of the national parliament, which is right here, that discusses issues of national governance, and Senate here discusses issues to do with the county administrations, with representatives from the people of Kenya, and these representatives are called senators. So under this, then, the equivalent of here is the governor, this is the president. For the cabinet here, they talk about the county executives, the CECs. And then for the national civil service, the equivalent under the county administrations is the county civil service. But away from those institutions or administrative units, not really, but governance units, not administrative units, governance units, we still have other units such as the judiciary which it's headed by the Chief Justice, and It's an independent arm of the government as well, just like the National Assembly, the Senate, and all these other units. And the judiciary makes interpretation of the laws that the National Assembly makes. And shortly we shall look at how all these interacting units function together. But we have new offices and institutions that have been created by the new constitution, such as the constitutional commissions and the constitutional offices. So since our concern really is in the idea of representative democracy and parliament being the assembly that represents the people of Kenya, we look at then what are the sources of law. And because parliament is just one of those sources of law, so that when we are looking at parliament and we are reporting issues to do with politics and parliament, we don't report this in isolation, but we do understand the entire ecology of how law is made. So if you look at what Professor Kifutha Kibwana is writing in his treaty of 1989, he is explaining that in Kenya we have different sources of law. And parliament is just one of those, which makes what you call the written law, the statute law. That is what parliament debates. But there is the supreme law, which is the Constitution of Kenya. And the Constitution of Kenya is, the current Constitution of Kenya was passed through a referendum. That is a vote, that the people voted the Constitution and its provisions and what the implications of those provisions are for different quarters and areas and sections of the society. And then out of the Constitution that then people like parliamentarians are able to debate and make laws that operationalize those provisions of the Constitution of Kenya. And because Kenya was colonized by the British, we inherited some laws from the British. And this is what you call the inherited or the received law, common law. So you find that some of the laws that apply in Britain still apply in Kenya. And there has been a gradual revision that has been happening over time on these laws. Around, some of them have been changed, some of them are still in existence, and they are effective in the country. And then if you look at what we spoke about the judiciary there, the judiciary also makes laws, but really not directly, but it makes laws through what we call precedent. And precedent is where judges, magistrates, and officers of justice determine or make determination about certain cases. And once they make this determination about these cases become points of reference for future cases that are related to that. That is what we call precedents. Therefore, if something that is related to what is currently being debated happens to occur, then lawyers can reference a certain decision that was made by judges. And we still have a customary law, and this also applies to Islamic law, laws that are governing certain cultures and contexts within the Kenyan society. For instance, laws to do with dowry and marriage. I don't know whether they are really laws, we might call them laws, but they are binding protocols, and they can be enforced by the society. So if you want to marry from a certain community, there are certain protocols that you have to adhere to. And then because Kenya is a member of the international community, it subscribes to international law. And international law here means that agreements and charters and treaties that have been signed and ratified by representatives of the Kenyan government, mostly through the president or through members of the national government, then Kenya is bound to articulate those laws or to enforce those laws within their jurisdiction. And that is why something like the International Criminal Court had proceedings, judicial proceedings against the current president and his deputy, and among other politicians in Kenya, because of the idea of international law, that we as a country, Kenya does not operate in isolation. It operates within the larger context of the global ecology of law. But law and policy are not one and the same thing, and it's important for journalists who are reporting around these things to understand that there is a difference between the two, even though there is a relationship between the two as well, that one leads to another, or one gives birth to another. So the idea of law is what parliamentarians discuss and make in Parliament. And law is defined as a body of rules of conduct, of binding legal force and effect that is prescribed, recognized, and enforced by controlling authority, mostly the police. But that is different from a policy, because a policy outlines what a ministry hopes to achieve. So if you think about the Ministry of Education, or the Ministry of Health, or the Ministry of Security, among others, these ministries are tasked with carrying out certain mandates that enable the national government to meet its promises to the people of the country. And these ministries then operate within the framework of policies. So if you think about something like free primary education, free secondary education, and the notion of free education in general being a manifesto that the current government, a part of the manifesto of the current government, then it is the Ministry of Education that drives that agenda into fruition. And then they come up with a policy that will effect that particular agenda. So that's how a policy works. A policy can inform law. So there might be a need for a law that will impact or that will enforce certain policies. And that is why I was saying that policies sometimes lead to the birth of laws. So when we are looking at the idea of media and what do journalists then play in a democracy, what is the role of journalists in parliamentary reporting and political reporting, we need to underscore an important notion that is said to be plurality of ideas and views, that democracy encourages people to participate, people of all walks of life and views and philosophies, to debate issues that are surrounding the society. And because then Parliament is a representation of the people's will, then the media becomes the sphere in which these ideas are debated and views are projected. So the media plays a very important role in encouraging plurality, the richness, the robustness of debate and ideas in the society, so that then the people of the country can exude or can have a complete sense of the notion of multipartism, because multipartism then brings different political ideologies into the assembly. Therefore, the media needs to have an understanding that these are views that need to be respected. They could be views from the minority, but nevertheless, they are views that need to be projected into the public sphere. And then the public sphere becomes, the newspapers, the TV, the radio, the internet platforms, among many others, that the journalists who report on these things represent within their context. So just to continue on the role of the media then, is to say that journalists are the eyes and the ears of millions of Kenyans who are unable to attend the House proceedings and witness what their representatives are saying. So while the representatives are representing the people also need some kind of oversight. And journalism plays that role of oversight role. So it becomes the ears, it becomes the eyes, it becomes the window through which then the people of the country are able to, have a peek into the assembly that is Parliament. So for a journalist, therefore, then to be an effective reporter in this area, which I earlier said it's a specialized area, what you call beat specialization, you need to have and to be aware of certain protocols. And some of the things that are required in this is a good source, or to have good sources within National Assembly. Therefore, you need to make friends with MPs, you need to know senators, and you also need to know people who work for Parliament, Parliament staff, Senate staff. You need to be aware, to develop contacts. A good journalist is usually judged by the level of sourcing that they demonstrate in their stories. And sourcing, therefore, then is collaborated when you have good sources, good people feeding you with information. So some other issues that one needs to be aware of is the Constitution itself, to read the Constitution well and understand what are the provisions, and I will talk about that shortly, some of the provisions of the Constitution that touch on the media itself, but also touch on what the media can and can't report when it comes to political and parliamentary reporting. And also a journalist needs to be aware of the procedures and standing orders of Parliament. You should be familiar with these terms such as motion of adjournment, when these members of Parliament adjourn, what are the privileges and immunities that Parliament affords, and I will talk about this in a short while. And also, you keep hearing the Speaker talking about point of order, members saying point of order, what does this mean? So you must become familiar with those terminologies and language of Parliament, and when motions are being moved, and not just motions, but also how the law is made itself. Now that you say that Parliament in the contextually makes a written law, you have to understand how the process of procedures of making law, the first reading, the second reading, and the third reading, how a bill is transformed into law, how the voting takes place, and what is the role of the Speaker, and other members of both the National Assembly and the Senate, and how the leader of the House, that is the leader of the majority, and the leader of the minority are elected, and then what is the role of reporters when they are in the gallery. So some points to remember here is that parliamentary reporters are strangers in the House. They are not the so-called bona fide members. While they are the eyes and the ears of the people out there, they are not really bona fide members of that assembly, because they are not elected. But because of the pivotal role that journalists play, then they are included as a part of the assembly. But that does not mean they should overlook their role, that they should be aware that they are strangers in that house. And it is important then, therefore, that they should be bound by the rules of operation and engagement within the parliamentary culture of doing business. So the journalists must observe these traditions, and they must comply with what is called the standing orders, the directives that come from the Speaker of the House. And then they should also understand the law that forms the Parliament in Kenya, the National Assembly's Act, and also the Powers and Privileges Act that also stipulates certain provisions that members of the House enjoy, and these privileges, we shall talk about them in a short while. What are they? What is the immunity around them? Very important thing for journalists here is to know that while you are in the House, you should not carry a recorder, video cameras, or film equipment into the House, because it is not allowed unless you have been authorized by the administration of the House. So what you need is just to sit in the gallery or the press gallery and listen and take notes. And among the reforms that are happening in Parliament now is the fact that now KBC, the public broadcaster, is able to take the feed from Parliament and broadcast it to the entire citizen, to the entire country. And then other private media houses, they pick that feed from KBC and they also share it with their viewers and listeners. Another part that is very important that we need to look at is parliamentary committees, which are a subset of the House and specifically debating and dealing with very specific issues. It could be Committee on Education, Committee on Health, Committee on Security, different issues. Journalists need to be aware that these committees exist and when they are meeting, and to have the rota of the issues that they are discussing among many others, because then this becomes very rich sources of information for the journalists to report about. But you need to be cleared by the Parliamentary Secretariat about the information that you're seeking on these committees. So at this point, let me talk about what you call parliamentary immunity, which really is a privilege for the members of Parliament, such that they can say anything during the debate without fear of legal action due to what we are calling parliamentary immunity. But that does not necessarily mean what they are saying is true. And therefore, what journalists need to do is you need to capture the responses when MPs are asked to substantiate unverified claims. Just to speak further on that immunity, there are two levels of it. There is the idea of absolute privilege, and in general, in Kenya, absolute privilege arises from judicial proceedings and parliamentary proceedings. And judicial proceedings here are not our concern in this class at this point. And therefore, our concern is the parliamentary proceedings, privileged, absolute privilege as a result of parliamentary proceedings. And if journalists want to report issues that have or are touching on this kind of proceeding, they need to meet certain conditions. And these conditions must be that Parliament reports must be fair, meaning that fairness, if you put yourself in the shoes of the person who is being reported on, the MP, is there a sense of fairness? Is there a sense of balance in the views that are being expressed? Are they also accurate? If you go back to the Hansard, which is a record of the parliamentary proceedings, the words that have been published in the media and the words in the Hansard, are they accurate? Are they a true reflection of what happened? Then there must be reports of proceedings heard in public. And what this means is that, the idea is that, they should have been broadcast to the people and not private entities or private conversations between MPs or MPs and other staffers. A very important aspect here is that these reports need to be published contemporaneously. And what contemporaneously means that is must be published simultaneously. As Parliament is happening, then a channel like NTV or KTN needs to pick that up and publish at the same time. That is the idea of contemporaneous. And it must not contain matter that is indecent or blasphemous. I think that is a bit self-explanatory. So when you think about what is fair, what constitutes fairness and accuracy, here the concern is on a different level. I mean, so it's on a number of levels, and it should show a true impression of the proceedings. Then it must present the position given by both sides, and that journalists should not tweak information or emphasize the weakness of one side at the expense of the other one. And then this must be carried out across the entire chain of journalistic reporting. So what is qualified privilege for journalistic reporting? What privileges do journalists who report from Parliament enjoy? That they can publish material that is being said by MPs as long as it's being published contemporaneously. And then the documents that are protected here include documents like the papers that have been tabled in Parliament, reports of parliamentary proceedings, reports of public meetings provided. They are fair and accurate and conform to the laws of libel and contain nothing that is blasphemous or indecent. So it should also be of public interest, concern, and benefit to the society. And others are like statements by the police, such as people who are wanted for certain crimes, among others. Sometimes MPs make statements that are of public interest, but they are not necessarily substantiated. And as a journalist who is reporting from this area, you need to be aware of a defense that is called fair comment, that someone made a fair comment about an issue that is not necessarily substantial in nature, but it is of public interest. So these words must be made in good faith, they must be without malice, and it must be a comment. And a comment is an expression of opinion or judgment, which is distinguished from a statement of fact. And a lot of MPs get away with this as a way of making fair comment. So the last thing that a journalist here needs to be aware of is the idea of malice. And malice is unjustifiable intention to inflict injury or to injure someone's feelings or to defame them. And malice in journalism is often caused by anger or prejudice. So, when you're thinking about the idea of fair comment, you need to be aware and to look at how that is impacting on the parties or the subjects who are being discussed within that context. So having said all that, class, this brings us to the end of our lesson today on parliamentary reporting, where we were able to see a couple of issues around the proceedings of Parliament and, the place, the origin, the development, and the place of Parliament in the current society. Keep well, and I will see you again soon. Thank you.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.